It's the saddest thing. World population is increasing, our cities are growing, more of us are living closer together than at any time in history, and the possibility of social connection is as close as our phone. But we're lonely. Lonely.
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Hey, it's great to have you with us here for another week of Signs of the Times Radio. We're going to be talking this week about the loneliness epidemic and its cure. And to help me to unpack these issues is the author of a great article in this month's edition of the Signs of the Times magazine. His name is Jared Stackelroth, and his article is entitled Community, Connection, Church. And I guess we're going to work our way through those themes as we chat. Thanks so much, Jared, for helping us out, for being here this week.
Yeah, thanks, Kent. It's great to be here. And some really important issues, I think, to talk about with, as you say, this loneliness epidemic that's going on. This is sort of, for me, writing this piece, it reminded me of a lot of important things. So, it was helpful for me to re-engage with this topic.
Yeah. I guess, like, right now, this is... I don't know, it's a complex and layered discussion because we're currently talking a lot about another epidemic or pandemic, I guess we should say, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are actually being encouraged to self-isolate, to disconnect from one another in physical ways, and yet we're aware that underlying our culture and our society in the West in particular, there is this sense of disconnection and this sense of loneliness. That kind of gets tricky, doesn't it?
It does, definitely.
And it's interesting too that over the last few years there's been this sort of increasing disparagement of, get your face out of that screen. Why are you wasting all your time on social media? Have some real contact with real people. And there's value in that. But now we're being told, hey, pick up the phone, call someone, because maybe visiting them in person might not be the best way to do things. Use social media. There are WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups kind of starting up where people are supporting their neighbours, helping each other out. People are contacting their elderly relatives and sort of looking after them. And it's sort of really good to see a community pull together. But then I guess we're also aware that there are people who were already isolated before this whole COVID-19 pandemic thing broke out. And perhaps right now they're even more isolated. I've heard really tragic stories about an elderly lady sort of parked outside a supermarket, sort of calling out of the window of her car for someone to please help to pick up some groceries for her because she's too afraid to go inside. And, while people sort of, walk past or, fail to make that connection. It's sad. Yeah,
and something that came out of my article that I've written here, up to 40% of elderly people don't receive any visitors. That shocked and sort of saddened me when I came across that statistic, because that's almost half. Almost half of all old people don't have anyone come and visit them at all.
Crazy.
Can you imagine that feeling? Like when you're working, you're seeing people every day. You have no real choice. When you've got kids at school or you're studying yourself, you're enforced into relationship. You're around people. But there are segments of our society, not just the elderly, but some of the...
Young adults is the one that really surprised me.
Yeah, young adults, accessibility challenged people who can't, attend a lot of the things that we take for granted. Sort of thing. They sometimes tend to self-isolate in some senses because they can't access what we always do.
Or even someone who's struggling with mental health issues or the sort of social behavioural sort of issues. It's really hard to make friends if you're struggling with those sort of issues.
Yes. And the young people is surprising, I guess, because... when we were young, we'd go down to the park with our mates and we'd be outdoors a lot and we'd run around, it was a really good time. But people are losing some of those, I guess, family, almost tribal or neighborly connections. And so the young people are just like on screens a lot and they are making connections. They are making friends in those places, but also those don't always seem as tangible or as real in their everyday life. And so when something challenging happens, when they go through a health or a mental health issue, they're feeling very disconnected and very isolated.
It's as if there's no one there to really help them sort of, put their life
through
back
that
together.
or support them. And I think our society, particularly in the West, has moved into isolation in a sense. Like, I was reflecting on how I've grown up in Adelaide. So everyone I grew up with, everyone in my family, my immediate family, don't live in this state. I'm in Sydney now. So I am disconnected from all of those natural networks that I was born into. I'm far away. And that's for work. That's for necessity. I have to be here. Now I've formed new groups here.
Yeah.
But you do have these severe breaks in your life where all of a sudden you find yourself a bit at sea. Who am I connected with now? Because everyone's really far away. They're really busy. I don't feel connected with anyone anymore.
And I guess it's that transition period that, as you're making that move from one state to another for work, or, you're in that transition period of perhaps, your kids are growing up and leaving home, or maybe you've left home and now you're sort of at uni somewhere else, trying to build a new group of friends. That is actually a time when people are really vulnerable. I understand there is actually social research that, backs that up. That's fascinating. Now, one transition that we've seen in our society, I mean, you probably remember when you were young, I remember when I was young, it was pretty typical for people to live in just a freestanding house with a yard, the classic kind of quarter-acre block, and running around under the sprinkler in the backyard sort of thing, sitting on the porch or the veranda in the front yard and saying g'day to people who wander past. Then we have television that drives us inside. Then we have air conditioning, and we shut all the windows and doors. And now we've got a situation where, we're being encouraged towards more medium or high density living. You now live in an apartment block in Sydney. So I'd be really interested to hear how you feel that change of your actual, physical built environment has, what impact has that had on your social connections, on your, does it connect you more with people? Does it isolate you more with people? Because I notice every time I visit an apartment building, I get into a lift with someone, there's no eye contact, there's no, like there's this wall that's up, I seem to sense in apartment buildings. Has that been your experience?
Not really, to be honest, Kent. We've got, in Sydney, a lot of us are forced to be in that sort of living because they're cramming us in. High density living seems to be the way of the future.
It's cheaper and you want a job.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so for us, it's what we can afford and the situation that we can be in. But having lived, so where I grew up, I was still a kid. I didn't really interact with the neighbours too much. There weren't kids my age in the street. To some extent. When I moved out into my first home to stay in, I was sort of in a more rural area, and a lot of the homes around me were holiday houses. There weren't really any neighbours that I saw on a day-to-day basis. And through church, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but we've been encouraged to make connections. So my wife and I were quite intentional moving in. For a little while we had some disconnect with our neighbours, but certainly as we've lived there for a few years, we've really gotten to know, especially on our floor, the neighbours there, but also other neighbours in the building quite well, and would consider them friends. I mean...
Do you see other people in your building doing that, making those deliberate efforts to reach out and connect, or is it a relatively rare phenomenon?
I think people are willing and wanting to connect, but they have trouble making the first step. So we have, in some senses, facilitated. Our neighbours on our floor now talk to each other and they're friends with each other because we've been mutual friends. And so we've talked with them.
Sort of brought them together.
We've been talking with them in the hallway, and then our other neighbour comes along who we also know. And so then they get talking with each other. And so there's that community which expands. Community sort of spreads. It's contagious.
It's sort of a ripple effect. Yep.
If you're willing...
Or contagious,
If
I like
talking about epidemics.
Yep.
If you're willing to make an effort or you're intentional about connection, people are actually, I do think, even if they're not suffering from some of these antisocial things or they're really lonely, they are wanting connection. Talking about coronavirus, there's been shortage of toilet paper, there's been all sorts of things.
I went out to Woolworths this morning, it's ridiculous.
It's just empty shelves. Well, our neighbour managed to find some, and she passed some on to us because we hadn't found any yet. And I've found some more since, but we're quite well. We've got enough for a week or two. We're comfortable. We were running low, and she jumped in and said, "Here, have some of my toilet paper. I've got enough." So, that's just, to me, that's just an example of what we should all be doing at times like this when people are feeling disconnected. How can we practically help someone? And that simple thing, we were intentional to build these relationships, but those relationships have blessed us in a sense that they are helping us and supporting us. And it's just a wonderful relationship that we have in that building.
And in your article, Jared, you point out that like human connection with others has more effect than just making you feel, nice and warm inside. That there are actual like medical, like physical, science. There's scientific evidence for the benefits of connection.
Yeah. Well, first of all, part of it would be preemptive to some extent because a lot of, I think, loneliness and some of the mental health sort of things are linked. Trauma and some of these things cause us to isolate.
Yeah.
And so when we do have that good support network, when we do have connection with other people, it helps us with some of those things.
It has a protective effect.
It has a protective effect. It makes us more resilient. Now, it doesn't necessarily cure that. You may still need counseling or you may need medication. I'm not advocating just, make friends and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Some of these issues are definitely serious issues that need extra intervention, but it does have that protective effect to have some of those connections. It's sort of, I did a creative writing master's degree, and part of the thing I was looking at was trauma narratives, stories of trauma, and how my premise was that stories can actually heal. The storytelling process, being told stories, telling stories, and that's all about connection. That's all about community. And so what I found in that research is somewhat connected to this and the protective nature of relationships helping us with some of these mental health, PTSD, depression, anxiety, some of that insulating effect that having those connections in place will help you to be happier. It will help you to be better off.
I guess that goes to the quality of the relationship too, because it's not everyone to whom you're able to say, hey, listen, I'm really struggling, I'm on medication for a mental health issue, or, I'm still struggling with some stuff that's happened to me in the past or whatever. There has to be a degree of trust and of vulnerability involved there.
Yeah, definitely. And so there needs to be care taken by you on who you connect with. Because if you're in toxic relationships, if there are people around you that are not good for you, not healthy for you, then those connections can actually cause some of those same problems that we're talking about. The other, I guess, about the protection thing, and also on the flip side of that, when you are disconnected, there's more of a chance you may get some of those mental health things. So I start talking about this show about the old people's home for 4-year-olds from the ABC.
Yeah. We watched that, yeah.
And 80% of those residents had mental health problems and other things, geriatric depression, they call it, because of the lack of connection.
Because of the isolation.
Wow. That's part of the root cause.
Yeah.
And the depression is just the symptom of that.
And having those preschool age kids in there, interacting with them, having this intergenerational experiences and encounters, just had an incredibly healing effect. Yeah, it was funny, it was heartwarming. Yeah. And you point out in your article that it did get a little misty in your lounge room from time to time.
My wife, of course.
Yeah, just your wife. Yeah.
No, it was beautiful to see those connections being made, and 4-year-olds are fun. Like they just say whatever they're thinking, and to some extent, old people do too. They just
past caring,
past the filter, just say whatever, and just to see these people interact who are completely at different spectrums of their lives, completely different ends, but they just opened up, and a lot of that stuff healed them, helped them to connect better. And the funny thing was, Kent, it wasn't just their mental health, their movement improved because they were more willing to get up and go because they wanted to be part of the activities.
Yeah, when you're dealing with a small child, that often involves bending down quite a lot and having to pick stuff up and
mobility, all that stuff.
Yeah,
they just felt better. So that's really important. The other thing, I guess, is that loneliness causes our brains to seek out rewards. So
Right.
they're not getting the dopamine or the hit that sort of a good connection, a loving hug, or might give you. So you're feeling starved of that,
And you look
so
for substitutes.
you're looking for something to give me a
Yeah.
hit. If it's comfort eating, for me, when I get stressed, that's a thing. It's like I don't.
Guilty, Your Honor.
Yep, right. So, but for some people, it's severe addictions. It's alcohol or
Yeah.
it's drugs, opioids. There's a lot of addictions we keep hearing about in our society. And I came across this lady who founded Seek Healing, which is a pioneering rehabilitation program that focuses on community and connection as part of the treatment plan.
Right. For like drug and alcohol addictions in particular.
Yeah, particularly addictions. And she's using this connection. She had been through opioid addiction herself. She had suffered from that. And I read an interesting book by a counselor who sees a lot of people to do with pornography addiction. It was a similar thing. He said just putting Band-Aids on the issue, just trying to address the symptom, the addiction, by accountability, by avoiding that activity that leads you to the
Just
stuff.
say no. Don't do that.
No,
Yeah.
don't do that. It wasn't really helping. There was always a relapse. There was always something else because it wasn't. One thing he studied in his research, he found that addressing the core of the problem, the core issue, would help much better than addressing the symptoms of the issue.
Yeah, I think there's a writer called, I think it's Johan Hari, Hari, who says similar things about like drug and alcohol addiction. Yeah.
I mean, it's a fairly new field of research. I think this guy was Jay Stringer. If you're interested in his work, Jay Stringer, he's a Christian psychologist, counselor who deals with addictions. But what this lady Jennifer Nicolason found is that she would get these people into communities, into groups, and into healing, and it would help address the addictions much more than just saying no. Accountability, some of those common things that we immediately think of when we think of addiction.
And rehab. Wow. You take this article in a direction that for some readers, Jared, might seem like a strange left turn because you ask us to consider a form of community connection that has been around for thousands of years, and you talk about the church. And again, this is a little ironic because we've had the Australian government, give us a series of, well, more than just recommendations, these are now bans, on groups of people meeting. So this is the direction where we're going, and churches are closing their doors, church buildings. And your article talks about the church. So what about the church, in the age of COVID-19? I mean, are the issues that you bring up in your article about, connection and how church is can be a healthy community and, yada, yada, yada. Does that still work in these sort of circumstances?
Look, I think it does, Ken, because we've got to remember that the church, for me, the church is people. If we look at the Bible, the church doesn't describe, the word church isn't a building. And it's not a group of 60 to 100 people meeting on a set day of the week in a specific place. That's not how the Bible ever sort of refers to church. The Bible uses a bunch of other different metaphors. The bride of Christ, a relational metaphor.
Yeah.
The temple or a building, but that's all the participants being bits of the building, bricks of the building, parts of the building together to make a greater thing.
Yeah, I think the Apostle Peter says something along the lines of you like living stones, being built up to be a temple of God. So,
right.
Yeah.
Living stones. So each among you is one of the bricks, not the building itself. And then the body of Christ. So the church being a body, you're all different bits of the body, but you all work together as one. You're all part of that. And so,
and there's diversity in that metaphor in particular, isn't there?
Well, that's right. The hand does a different thing to the foot. Paul talks about the eye being different to the feet and the hands and the mouth, and all the different bits of the body have different functions, but they have some unity of purpose.
They complement one another.
It keeps you well, it keeps you moving around, that sort of thing. So that's the first thing. The church is not a building. So when they say we have to shut our churches, that doesn't mean church ceases. That's not the end of church, because we are the church. As people we can be the church wherever we go, wherever we meet. So yes, okay, there's some restrictions on the number of people you can have in one place, but a group of 2 or 3. He says in the Bible, it says,
Well, Jesus said that himself,
I
didn't
think
he?
he did.
Yeah.
Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'll be there also. That's my church. That's where I am. So
Right. And no country has limited 2 or 3 so far.
not yet. That's right. Church happens at your home.
Yeah.
It can happen anywhere. So we're not limited by the place or the restrictions on movements in that sense. What we are limited by is our willingness to love and serve each other and to connect with other people.
Now, Jared, you grew up in a fairly traditional church, and I
Yes.
know this because my mother-in-law still attends that church, and your parents do, do too.
Yep.
And I understand you still feel fairly warmly about that church. But since coming to Sydney, you've become involved in some fairly sort of innovative models of church. Are you able just to give us just a little thumbnail sketch of what that looks like, and perhaps in particular in terms of connection, how those sort of more innovative models actually facilitate and encourage those healthy connections and healthy relationships?
Yeah, let me just say that with both of those churches, you've painted at sort of different ends of the spectrum, and
Sure.
they kind of are. In some senses, they're very different way of, I'll use air quotes here, doing church, right? The same,
As in going through the motions sort of thing. Yeah.
a program or whatever, you know. But at the same time, they both had a common element that I appreciated, and that was the love and the relationships in that space. You know, as a kid growing up in the more traditional 3 hymns and a prayer, sort of a liturgical service,
Yeah,
very much similar.
Pews and a pulpit.
Pews and a pulpit, similar every week. You know what to expect. And yet I still felt that relationship from some of the people there. Still felt valued by them and cared for by them.
People invite each other home for lunch after church and things like that.
Intergenerationally, the old people would ask how I was going, the older than me people. The friends in my Sabbath school class, all my friends, my peers, my parents' age group, they would all have picnics after church together. We had a lot of connection, and it was really good. But the church I'm in now throws out maybe some of the liturgical, traditional
the more
elements.
formal elements.
It's well, church, the sermon is more of a discussion. The preacher might ask questions and expect answers. We might break up in between and wrestle with some questions together before presenting it back to the wider group. It's a much more informal,
interactive,
modern, you could say, setting. But the love and the connection still needs to be there to make it work. That's what I've found. But part of that for this current church that I'm at is the cell groups, the small groups that we get together and meet. And it might only be 2 or 3 or 4 of us who meet once a week outside of the traditional service of church hour. Right. So outside of the Sabbath or the Sunday morning, we're on a weeknight. Or some people meet during the day. If they're stay-at-home mums, they can get together with their kids and have a small group in that sense.
Okay. So, are those groups sort of demographically formed? I mean, you mentioned mums with kids. Are there other groups that are more older people or more men or women?
We
or,
have had
some of those sort of safe spaces.
Well, it tends to be gender specific depending on the situation, and that helps to be authentic and be real. So I had an experience of a few difficulties, which I mentioned in my article, rough sort of patch, and those guys in my cell group could really support and love me through that. And similarly for them, they've had some certain things going on in their life, and it was really a space we could do that.
So clearly you'd built that trust with them over the months and the
trust,
years.
Relationship, all those things were there already. And so when something terrible happened, you could wrestle with that together. They were there to support you. And so they do somewhat be demographically or gender specific, but also geographically. So people that are sort of a bit closer together will tend to form, because we have people that travel a little way to come to our church. And so some of them live closer to each other. So they form groups where they're closely connected in that region.
And I guess that's important. I mean, if you as a church are concerned for the issues that are going on around your community, it helps you actually live in that community. And
that's right.
Then you're able to actually do something.
You live nearby other people who are in your small group, and then you can address, perhaps it's not the same neighborhood as your church, wider body of church meets, but you can be more aware and interactive of things that are happening in your suburb or your sort of area. And so then you can, for example, our neighbours, we've quite often run events, or you could call them parties, or missional sort of opportunities on our balcony, had a big barbecue for everyone.
And it's not just your church friends, you're actually
the
inviting
guys
your neighbours
in
too.
my cell group bring their friends.
Oh, right.
So we all bring our friends, but because we're sort of close together, they're in some of the surrounding areas and they come in with us. We invite all of our neighbours, friends, Christian friends, non-Christian friends, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, whoever we're friends with, whether associating in our everyday lives, our work lives, or in our neighbourhood. For us, our neighbours, we invite them to that, of course, because we're just meeting, eating, and having a good time, and everyone can enjoy that. That's to try and build connection and build a sense of community in our spaces that we live in. We call it a sphere of influence, in your sphere of influence.
Yeah. And I guess some of our listeners might be thinking, wow, where can I find a church like that? And there may, or there probably won't be, something in your immediate area. So how do we go about moving towards that sense of closer connection of, if we're a believer in particular, how do we go about being the church rather than just going to church? Just as we finish off, because we're just about out of time.
Yeah, good question, Ken. Look, I think, may have to go to church, a bigger, broader, sort of more traditional church. If you do that, you might find people there who are already doing some of these smaller groups.
Right. Okay.
You may find that they're not, or you may find that church is not for you. Don't give up. There are plenty of different churches with different styles. There's the more traditional, like I grew up, which would be fine. If that was the only church in my area, I could embrace that and go with that. If it was a more innovative or contemporary, people use that word, church, then that'd be fine too. But you may have to go. Sometimes you can find some of these groups on the internet. You Google ahead and find out, hey, what's happening in my area? Who's
I think
around?
There's some like on Meetup and
Meetup. People are doing groups. But I guess in light of what we talked about before, the Corona stuff, church is changing, and so perhaps forming a little group with your neighbours, or I've been thinking in light of this, I've been thinking for a while, how do I invite my neighbours to experience the connection I have at church? And that's a difficult thing to get them to come out of their lives and go there. What would be so much easier is to meet in my home, have a meal, and perhaps something uplifting or positive or encouraging in these difficult times, right? Inspirational, you could say. So I'm thinking, well, I can't go to church, but I can still see my neighbours. They're just next door. As long as they're healthy and everyone's healthy and we're not spreading things around, why don't we meet up? Why don't I check in with them from time to time? If you're lacking connections, sometimes other people around you are too, and you can be the impetus. You can provide the impetus to make it happen. You can be the spark, be the catalyst that gives people this sense of connection.
It's important to reach out. It's important to connect. Hey, thanks so much, Jared. You've really given us a lot to think about. I think what's clear is that we really do have, a genuine need for human connection. It's the way we were created to be.
I think we're wired for it, definitely.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for your time this week. Really appreciate it, Jared.
Thanks for having me.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.